How do you define the physical determinism aspect that comes next? So just how do you think of free will most basically?
Well, let me tell you how I don't think of it, because it's the way most people do intuitively. Sorry. And I think where a lot of people get into trouble, which is you make a choice. You form an intent and you act on it. You choose vanilla over chocolate, or you decide to pull the trigger instead of not pulling the trigger. You have formed an intent and you have acted on it. And most people's intuitive sense of free will then revolves around three issues. Yeah, did you intend to do that? Um, did you realize what the likely consequence was going to be of you doing that? And did you realize no one was forcing you? You had alternatives. You were not being coerced. And for most people, and in most courts of law, if the answer is, yeah, you intended, you knew what was going to happen, and you knew you didn't have to do that, that's it. You exercise free will, culpability, responsibility, punish accordingly. And from my perspective, that misses 99% of what's going on. That's like deciding you could only read the last 2 pages of a book and conclude how you felt about the book or not. Because what that stance does is leaves out the only possible question in all of this stuff is, well, where'd that intent come from? How did you turn out to be the sort of person who would intend to do that at that point? And none of that, could you have done otherwise? And did you realize what the consequences would be? None of that remotely, none of that touches on that at all. And most people's folk intuitions about volition and free will is built around, did you intend to do what you just did? And did somebody force you to do that? No. Okay, we're done. And instead, the only question to ask is, how did you become that sort of person who would intend to do that? And the answer is, you became that sort of person because of all of the biology that led up to this moment over which you had no control, and its interactions with all of the environment that led you up to that moment over which you had no control. And given that, my definition of free will would have to be a brain has just produced a behavior, and the brain did that independent of every single thing that occurred prior to that moment. The brain did that independent of its history. The brain was an uncaused cause. And show me that you could have traded out with that person's brain its genome, its childhood, its prenatal environment, what you had for breakfast that morning, whether your right butt is itchy or not, everything in between, and show me that everything could have been changed and that brain would have still produced the exact same behavior, and that's free will. And you can't do that because it doesn't work that way. And every attempt of philosophical compatibilists who say, yeah, we're made of things like cells and molecules and such, but there's still room for free will. Every single one of them saying somehow the brain could still have done that and be completely freed of everything that comes before requires a step that's magic.
So we can make sense of the idea of free will. It would be making decisions that are not caused by something before that decision is made. But as good physicalists, we have to rule this out because everything is caused by something before it.
Unless, God help us, we're now trapped in an elevator who is a free will quantum indeterminist who will try to explain to you why this one domain, if most, but I now understand not all physicists agree, there's a basic indeterminacy there, that somehow or other you could get from subatomic indeterminacy to explaining the freedom with which we design our moral sense of right and wrong and our moral compasses. And it can't work that way. Otherwise, yeah, because why did you just do what you did? Because these neurons just said this, and those neurons stopped saying that to this part of your brain, and your muscles moved accordingly. And why did that happen? Because of what happened in the environment a few minutes ago that triggered you to do that. And what happened else? Because the hormone levels this morning that made your brain more or less sensitive to those environmental cues. And whether you've been traumatized or found God or love or whatever in the last 10 years, and what your adolescence was about, and what sort of frontal cortex you finished building then, and your childhood and your field life and your genes and the culture your ancestors invented, because that shaped how your mother was mothering you within minutes of birth, and what ecosystems had to do with what cultures they invented and evolution thrown in. And when you look at why did you do what you just did, the answer is because of what came a second before and a minute before and an hour and a lifetime and a million years before. And the key thing with that is when you look closely, this is not saying, oh, all these different disciplinary perspectives have something to say with how we became who we are. They're all one set of influences and one set of determinisms. If you're talking about genes and behavior, by definition, you're also talking about evolution and the evolution of genes. If you're talking about genes and behavior, you're by definition talking about childhood experience and the epigenetic changes you made in gene regulation for the rest of your life. If you're talking about genes, you're talking about the proteins you just made in this part of your brain 20 minutes ago under the direction of your genes. It all turns into one continuum of determinism that made you who you are. And there's not a crack anywhere in that edifice where you could shoehorn in a free will that requires stuff to occur completely independent of what came before.